just people from here. It's come to a point now where enough is enough.
We hatched this plan, a running exploratory road trip.
Wow, मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा.
Because water was coming in the house, gunfire was erupting. Never thought that it would come to this.
Good afternoon. My name is Alelia Bundles, and I welcome you on behalf of the March on Washington Film Festival Board of Directors. During the first year of the festival, I attended as a fan and a person who is deeply interested in history and activism. 9 years later, I am still a fan, but more important, I'm an advocate. The March on Washington Film Festival uses film screenings as a platform for panel discussions featuring filmmakers, scholars, and activists, as well as performances by artists and workshops to tell stories of the icons and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement. One of my favorite moments of the last 9 years was seeing a teenage friend surrounded by 6 veterans of the civil rights movement. They were learning from each other as the older men talked about their experiences in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, and my young friend shared some of his own experiences. It is that intergenerational dialogue that is one of the most powerful hallmarks of this annual event. As a longtime journalist, I'm particularly interested in this afternoon's topic, how to be a citizen journalist. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, it was television news that made the nation and the world aware of injustice, inequality, racial violence, and systemic racism. But of course, there was always the Black press, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Baltimore Afro-American, Jet Magazine, and more that had been documenting our stories for more than a century. Today, we have smartphones, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, blogs, and many other platforms to tell the stories that don't make it into the New York Times and the Washington Post. It was 17-year-old Darnella Frazier who captured the murder of George Floyd on her camera phone. And it is young adults like Jerome Foster II who are raising awareness, tackling climate change, creating media platforms like The Climate Reporter, and spurring us into action. It is my pleasure to welcome K-12 educational leader, Christina Ishmael, who will introduce Jerome.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for that introduction, Alilia. My name is Christina Ishmael, and I am a K-12 educator. And this year, we were very intentional to include more K-12 teachers and students at the March on Washington Film Festival, which is one of the reasons we are joined here today for this workshop with Jerome Foster II. I am so thrilled to be joined by him to hear about his work that he has done. He's only 19. I'm sorry, I have to say that. I think it's important for our friends in K-12 to understand that they don't have to wait until they're adults to start this work. So let's hear more about his work. What have you been doing, Jerome? Tell us all about it, please.
Thank you for having me a part of this conversation, Christina. It's great to be here. My name is Jerome Foster II. I currently work as a White House climate advisor, and I'm a climate justice activist. But I started my activism journey through journalism and through telling stories of how young people can get involved in the environmental movement, and now through the Climate Reporter. I started with my English teacher. I had created like 2 or 3 blogs after school and wrote about why young people need to be a part of the environmental movement to show the scale, scope, and speed of the climate crisis and the action that's needed and the intergenerational unity that's also needed as well. So through that union of my English teacher and my history teacher and myself, basically writing stories about the climate crisis and telling the impact that it's having not on just America, but on frontline communities, we're able to write over 160 articles within that first year. And that led directly into actions like the Sunrise Movement doing sit-ins at Nancy Pelosi's office, to the 0 hour, the 0 hour first ever youth climate march. And that was all covered by youth, for young people to be able to be seen in new ways. Because prior to the Climate Reporter, there really wasn't young people in the conversation. There was primarily only Jutez Scott Martinez, who's an amazing Indigenous activist. And it was like, I know there's more young people that want to be a part of this movement. And through that, we did that. So, yeah.
That's so incredible. So how many years would you say that you've been doing this then?
So I started in 10th grade about 3 or 4 years ago. And yeah. I stopped doing it around 11th grade because I transitioned from journalism into traditional activism. But it was about a year and a half.
Okay. So you mentioned the role of your English teacher. Was that your 10th grade English teacher?
Yes.
Yeah. What inspired you to work directly with that English teacher then?
Yeah. I guess it was compound 2 things. It was like the reason why I started the Climate Reporter was because of a documentary film about why we don't cover climate properly in the media. And also my English teacher just taught me so much about reasoning and like backing up our arguments with like so many different like counter arguments and counter perspectives, and really just sharing a different perspective that I didn't have before. And she really just helped me to, one, tell a more nuanced story, and also to make it more applicable to people that aren't just living in the US and have our biases embedded in how we tell stories.
That's great. Thank you. We're going to get into how you become a citizen journalist like this. And I have a few activities that we're going to ask teachers and students to actually use in their classrooms or at home, wherever they may be. And so we will actually get to practice some of the things that you talk about here with us. And I think that's really important to kind of preface as we continue with this interview here. So let's talk about what causes you to want to take action. You've already kind of alluded to that, but give us a little bit more.
I think that what causes a person to take action is, one, identifying a cause that's not being addressed, and especially with a climate crisis, it's a crisis that's it's not being addressed, and also it's clearly preventable. And I think that the next thing that causes action is seeing that you have a power to make a change. Like as an activist and as a young person and being in America, we know that we have an immense opportunity to make a transformative difference in the systems that perpetuate the climate crisis. So I think that really the way that why people get organized is in a more emotional state. Also, is thirdly, is just a lack of optimism and a lack of community action. And we need hope in order to continue pushing our communities forward. And that hope only comes from community organizing, communities coming together and making that possible. So I think that's one of the main reasons why we come together and why we're seeing so much community-led action right now.
That's great. So how did you decide becoming a citizen journalist was the most effective way to become an activist? And you said that you've kind of stepped away from that necessarily and then consider yourself more as an activist now. But how did you start with the idea of the citizen journalist?
Yeah, so I started as a journalist in not the sense of writing articles in first, but through technology and now through virtual reality. And I see that the most powerful way to tell a story is through storytelling. It's through allowing yourself to be in someone else's shoes. And being a programmer and being a computer science student, and like before I was an activist and before I was even writing articles, I saw that if you allow someone to understand that we have different perspectives and we live different lives, and people that are in Guatemala are facing the climate crisis right now through drought, or like communities in Bangladesh are being flooded out of their homes, and you're able to tell that through a lens that people are able to relate to, then that changes how someone sees the world. Because especially in like Western countries and in the global North, we oftentimes like to figure out that we can insulate ourselves from the climate crisis, but we aren't. We're all on this planet together, and if we're united in crisis, we must be united in our solution. And that's what really propelled me to start journalism and to continue being a citizen journalist, is because first you have to allow everyone to understand that we're all on the same level playing field, and that we all have to work in a unified manner. And the transition away from journalism kind of shifted into how, at the time, the climate movement was just emerging in 2017, and we're just now seeing a lot of marches and major actions. And I was going to a march. I was also writing about the march, and I was writing an article. So it was like, I felt kind of biased in the way that I was telling it. And I was like, maybe I should pass this on to other young people. Instead of just passing it on to my peers and just other young people that I knew, that I actually reached out to people that are at the front lines and said, hey, instead of us telling your story for you, why don't you tell it for yourself and give you that power to do it? Just starting for a little bit, I'm going to go back a bit. But yeah, that transition away from journalism into activism kind of transitioned from just the need to tell stories and to get involved in movements. And I started out in the beginning of the climate movement when there was the climate march in the sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office. And we were like, if we're going to tell the story, let's get people that are at the front lines that they can tell their own story. And oftentimes when we fall into the biggest trap in citizen journalism is that we kind of put everyone else's struggle through someone else's lens. And really what people at the front lines is crisis. Just starting for a little bit, I'm going to go back a bit. But yeah, that transition away from journalism into activism kind of transitioned from just the need to tell stories and to get involved in movements. And I started out in the beginning of the climate movement when there was the climate march in the sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office. And we were like, if we're going to tell the story, let's get people that are at the front lines that they can tell their own story. And oftentimes when we fall into the biggest trap in citizen journalism is that we kind of put everyone else's struggle through someone else's lens. And really what people at the front lines of this crisis are facing is not just suffering, but it's also adapting. And it's also championing the fact that they are being resilient through this. Their only story isn't struggle. It's also active resistance. So I think giving that and through that journalism was the way that I transitioned.
That's great. So you mentioned that you had a background in computer science as well, and that you were kind of focusing on the technology and you came into things like that. I think that's really important to highlight for a lot of our K-12 students, is that there's kind of the separation between STEM and humanities. And really what I hear you saying is that you can actually do both. Is that what you would say?
Absolutely. It's not either or, it's both and. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, that's really great. We are joined by many teachers and students for this session, and so I'd love for you to talk us through your process. So you mentioned storytelling. We know that storytelling is significant in this whole process, and we even talk about that. I used to teach really young kids, kindergarten and second grade, and we would start to talk about telling your story from kindergarten. So talk us through the whole process, how you tell this story.
So I say that one of the easiest ways you can get started is through there's a few websites. Either you can make your own website and start a blog, or you can go to medium.com, which is where I started it, and just write a story. And really where I started was talking about something that you really care about. Like maybe if you're most passionate about the Brazilian rainforest, or you're most passionate about the most recent Hurricane Ida, start with that, because you feel most connected to it. And that's how I started. I started with telling stories of what was happening in Washington, D.C. and what was happening in the youth climate movement at the time, and also talking about what was happening across Asia and Europe to combat the climate crisis and the solutions they were using. So start with what you love and then build from there and get other people to join you. That's what I would say.
Awesome. So there's a great application for students and teachers that we will actually make sure that we kind of highlight some of those things that are important to us. So we'll give folks a chance to do that at the end here. But how do you find some of these compelling stories?
How do you find compelling stories? I think that oftentimes you don't want to just copy other news articles. I've seen that oftentimes when I started out, I was just like seeing like something that was covered in the New York Times, The Guardian, and retelling that story. But I found the most unique and interesting stories by going, like, really, if there's a news, or if you're on Twitter, if you're on Instagram, we have the unique opportunity to reach out to people that are going through this right now. And one of the most pressing examples was in India, where they're having the farmers protest, and they were talking about the fact there was flooding and that they need more government aid and support. So I was like, instead of me just reusing the same interview that someone did at the New York Times, why not reach out to some farmers that are in India? And I just sent them a message on Twitter and said, hey, I want to cover you for a blog that I'm talking about, and want to talk about how we need to raise awareness of this. And through that, you develop a deeper connection, and you're able to understand how something that's happening in India is also the same thing that's happening in Louisiana. You're able to understand the intersectionality of these movements, and understanding that this is intersecting with geopolitics, is intersecting with women's rights, is intersecting with racial justice. And very quickly, you'll see that by you going to the source and understanding and them telling their own story allows you to tell a more richer experience. And that oftentimes is stripped away when it comes to big media. It's like oftentimes they just want to get that one story and that's it. But when you have that natural connection, you're able to really build a bond with what you write about and what you use to tell stories. So, yeah.
I love it. And I love to hear how you're leveraging social media in this whole thing. I know that back in the early 2000s and the early 2010s, people, especially teachers, were very afraid to even talk about social media with their students. And now we have standards that we use in classrooms to try to encourage them how to be, digital citizens and how to use things appropriately and effectively. And so it's really great to hear you talk about how you've used that. I know that surprisingly, I've actually learned a lot through TikTok videos. Are you using any sort of platform like TikTok when you think about this, or are you sticking with your Medium blog?
No, I use Twitter, I use Instagram, I use TikTok, I use pretty much any social media that's available, and just tell stories through that way. Even if it's not even just a blog, making like short TikTok videos about 1 minute or 2 minutes long, that can reach even more people. So any medium is great.
To be just as interested and possibly publish your article?
I gotta say, I actually wasn't too concerned with that in the beginning. I just was interested in like creating something that was new. In my perspective, I was like, I want to just have a space for the movement to be able to tell its own stories. But after a while, I saw that there were like newcomers like Now This News and other media that was willing to tell youth stories. And I think that one of the best ways to like get it into like a big publication, if you're interested in doing that, is one to basically make yourself like embedded in that situation. Like if you're a person that's living in Maryland and you're seeing that there's deforestation in their backyard and you want to write a story about that, that is one way you'll get into a major news publication, is your proximity to it. But if you're telling a story of something that's happening in in Hong Kong and you're in Maryland, then they're like, what is your expertise in that subject matter? So really try to make sure you embed yourself in that community, because only you and your community can tell it in this most authentic form. And I'd say another way I've seen is just to really tell it in a unique way, like not just having quotes and just like explaining it and then going on to the next quote and then explaining that, but actually having either videos that complement it, or really interesting photos that show the duality of the fact that they're going through a really tough time, or that you're showing two aspects at the same time. Whether it's in Kern County, California, where they have no access to clean water, but they're right next to a clean water reservoir. That's a photo that shows, wow, this is really injustice at its most prevalent form, is because clean water is right next to them, but because of the law, they have no access to it. So really showing that duality is another great avenue to get it into a big publication.
Great. I'd love to describe what research looked like when I was in high school and college, but yours is a little more relevant for students today. Can you help us understand how you do your research?
Research. I love doing research. I would say I really do. I just love like going in details. I would say for me, I live on like Congress.gov and other federal websites of like reading legislation, because it's like I find it really fun. It's like just you can go through the dictionary, find new words and things like that. So that's kind of how I do my research for articles, or I used to. And also I just used my school resources. Like they had like a library that was like I say like a half a mile away from my school, and I just like catch the train and just go to my library and say, hey, what books do you have on this topic? So I get like a historical perspective as well. I think that was really cool. Like that was my research, is like just trying to relate the past to the present and the future, like tell that all in one unique story to get like a full context of it.
That's great. So you mentioned libraries. Shout out to libraries.
Yes.
I also love that you love reading legislation. Not many folks would say that, but that's good. So what kind of research resources did you use in high school compared to college now, or compared to just kind of general citizens? What research resources do you use?
Yeah, I'd say in high school, I mostly use my library, and I mostly use online resources like Google to find like PDFs. I used Purdue Owl. I think that's the website that I used.
Yep.
For I searched by only using peer-reviewed research, because that's like the gold standard. That's what my English teacher said.
Absolutely.
And basically I went through that and used those resources to do my research. And also just using Congress.gov, like I said. And I still use Congress.gov to this day, and that hasn't really changed. But the aspect of science and data has changed a bit, where I try to go directly to scientists, whether it's the IPCC group of scientists, or whether that's just independent scientists that have done research with regards to the environment. I try to go directly to them to get the full picture. And I'd say like it's a lot of times it's not feasible for most people. So oftentimes I'd say consult like their book that they've written. I would say like one really good one. I'll bring this one up. All We Can Save is a really good one, written by all women-led scientists and community organizers. And this is a great resources that I've used for my research and other articles that I've written. So yeah.
Awesome. Are there specific databases or search engines? You mentioned Google, but we know that sometimes it doesn't always bring back the peer-reviewed articles that you mentioned. So then librarians might point us towards databases. Do you have any databases that you prefer?
I'd say database that I prefer. For images, I really like to find I go to Yandex, which is like an Eastern European website that has like but it has like pixelated recognition is like really technical, but they basically can find an image based off any other image and get like so many other results that you normally couldn't find. I'd say for research, I would oftentimes just really do in-depth Google searches, and there's like a lot of tricks to Google searches. Like if you use parentheses and if you use like dashes and you use like a dash delete, you can have like really, really nuanced searches that X's out all the things that aren't needed. And I had like a 2 or 3 page like Excel sheet that had like all the tags you could use to like change Google search.
That's good. Every librarian right now is probably freaking out that you're mentioning Boolean searches. And I just have to say, well done, well done. Advanced searching within any kind of search engine or database is incredibly important because it does bring back more targeted results. And so it's always good to hear. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's keep talking about your process here. So interviews, you've already mentioned that you reached out to farmers in India, for example. They're critical pieces in researching a given topic. Help us understand how you conduct interviews. Do you do it via Skype or Zoom, or do you do it in person? Like, give us kind of the rundown of what that looks like.
Yeah, so I was really structured with my interview process. I had like one Google document where before I did an interview, I would say, what are my questions? I have my teacher review it and say, are these good questions? Then also I go and say, wait, do I want to, like, what is the time zone difference as well? Because that could also be a big shift. And try to always make sure it's like more comfortable for them than you. Because like you're trying to get them at a most opportune time. If you're interviewing them at 1 a.m. and it's like 2 p.m. your time, then they're going to be really sleepy, really tired, and not going to give the best responses. So I'd say that is a really thing to be cognizant of, is time difference. And also, in doing interviews, oftentimes I try not to use the word climate change. Very controversial statement, but I would say that oftentimes in other countries, it's a very partisan thing, and it's like a really weird thing to talk about. And just talk about what's naturally coming up. Like whenever you have a conversation, just talk about what's naturally happening in the community, saying what floods have you seen, or what natural changes have you seen in your environment, and then climate change will naturally come up in the conversation. It will then allow them to bring that connection and understand that what's happening in their community is a part of a larger system that's happening across the world. And I'll say a really big tip that I learned the hard way was by doing interviews over time. I learned that not sticking to your questions. Like oftentimes you'll have a set of questions that you'll go in with, but be free to let them guide you. Like let them talk for maybe like 10 to 15 minutes. And instead of just instantly going to question number 2, follow up, because maybe they say my farm was just recently flooded because of this major event, and now I'm going in to study how I do irrigation differently at school. Maybe your next question is like something regarding like another flood that's happening, but maybe you should ask them about what they're studying at school and what drove them to study and what do they see next. Based off of what they say, you can develop an entirely new article just based off of their words. So I'd say that is good too. And last one, I know I'm talking a lot. But
no, keep going. That's why we're here.
Yeah, one last thing is that really at the end of the conversation, always ask, did I miss anything? Did I miss any questions that you didn't want to talk about? And what other things do you want to be heard or brought up or raise awareness to? So those are all my tips on that. So
good. I love that we're modeling this whole idea around interviews right now, because I can interview you and I have my list of questions that I am referring to right now, but you've said some things that have clearly gone off script. And so that's exactly how interviews happen. And I'm so glad that you highlighted that, because you can kind of dig deeper based off of what someone says. And that may not be where you wanted the interview to go, but you may get an entirely different story out of that. So to follow up on that, then, what do you do if they can't or won't answer your questions?
That happened quite a number of times, because it's like you're basically a stranger coming up to them, asking them questions, poking and prodding in their life. I'd say that I'll say like the thing that stopped and like that's helped when I just follow up is genuinely try to like ask them questions about what's going on, maybe outside the story. Like if you're approaching them about a specific thing, whether it's say the Inuit Circumpolar Council, they were having a meeting about young people coming together and being indigenous and sharing that on the COP24 meeting. At that time, they didn't want to talk about COP24. They wanted to talk about how indigenous people are really revitalizing their land and how they are taking charge of it. And through that, the story pivoted, and it's like, oh, you guys didn't really want to talk about this. You actually want to talk about something else. And also, if they don't want to talk in general, I'd say that I'll just try to genuinely be interested in what they are doing. Like, ask them other questions about, well, what do you see? What are you most passionate about? What are you doing for hobbies? What are you doing for things like that? And that will naturally bring you back to the conversation because they reached out to you and responded to your email for a reason. So, and if all of that doesn't work, just reach out to another person.
And if all else fails, we go to someone else. So then how do you pick some of these subjects or these folks that you interview? Again, going back to you found some farmers in India through Twitter, you DM'd, that was one approach. How do you find other people for different topics?
Most of the time, I basically try to go and find an organization. Mostly, I try to go to organizations first and then individuals second, because organizations will most likely have a person that has the subject matter in what's going on. Like, say in New York City, they have an organization called We Act that is specialized in all the New York City gardens that are all across New York. But if you talk to one New York City gardener, they'd be like, well, I don't really know what's happening in New York. I just have this one garden. So reach out to orgs first and then people second. That's what my process is.
Okay, that's really helpful. We are coming to the end of our time together, and my final question is about kind of your whole process coming together. I'm wondering if you can talk us about kind of the top 3 components of a well-written story.
Top 3 components of a well-written story. I spent a lot of time thinking about these 3 things because there's so many different components that go into a well-crafted story. And first, I have to say is empathy and compassion. That's number 1. If you're just sterile and just trying to be just a journalist that's like completely unbiased, then you'll miss a huge lack of context and intersectionality. Like for the news, oftentimes when we have local news, they'll just tell one story and not link it to climate change. So empathy is really key. Second, I'd say is scope. Not scope. That's linked into empathy as well. That's still number 1. I'd say second is make sure that when we think about the second one, I have a third one, but the second one I think would most help is to get a counter argument. Whenever I do an article and I completely have one side, a lot of times the responses will be, you didn't even think about the fact of this. You didn't think about this drawback of there's this new material for environmentalism that can be used to combat plastics and we don't have to use plastics anymore. But the first counter argument is how long will it take for that to be commercially available for people to actually use? And then second, is that affordable for people to use in most contexts? So I think having a great counter argument is the best. And third, I have to say is to always look at those most affected people in most affected communities. When we talk about a situation and we say, oftentimes when we have like a case study and we really dig deep into one article, we don't think about the whole timeline of the environmental movement. A lot of times when we only talk, let's give it a clear example because that's kind of vague. I'd say that when we first started writing a bunch of articles, we oftentimes say that young people are the leaders of the movement and that we're like bringing it forth. But then we hear back from adults saying, hey, we've been here since like the 1970s fighting this fight. You guys are on our shoulders. Like, let's bring it back down to the people that founded this and always try to reach back in the past for something that's already happened. Like oftentimes with the Green New Deal, we don't think about the fact that that infrastructure was built off of 350.org and Sierra Club, which has been here for decades. They didn't have the massive movement that we have today. And I think going back and making sure that we honor the past in order to really prepare for the future is the best. So look in the past, make sure you have intersectionality and empathy and compassion. And all those 3 things would be great to have a good story.
So helpful. Thank you. Like any good interview, is there anything that I didn't ask you or that you want to make sure that folks here in the room with us right now get to hear from you?
I'd say one last thing For any young person that's watching, or any like young person that wants to be a citizen journalist, always know if you're testifying or if you're interviewing or if you're meeting with other people, always know that like as a young person and as a person who's a part of this movement, you're fighting for clean air, clean water, and a livable future. Inherently, as this movement, we're on the right side of history. So never be shy, never be anxious or like too nervous to walk up to a person and ask, because the worst thing they can say to you is no. The worst thing they can do is just not answer your question. You just move on move on to the next person. But there's always opportunity. There's always options for you to go out and be adventurous. And if you have an energetic and positive energy, people will give that right back to you. So that's what I have to say.
I love that so much. And truthfully, I think that you might actually get answers as a younger person sometimes versus an adult. So do it. Right?
Yes. Yes.
Jerome, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your expertise today, and encouraging our young activists all around the U.S., but even outside of the U.S., to share their stories, but to also kind of dig in and investigate stories that they might be passionate about. We really appreciate your time today.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. And keep on writing.
All right, folks, we're going to switch over now. So if you are in a classroom setting, or maybe you're at home, so maybe you are a 6th through 12th grader, or maybe you're a college student and you want to apply some of the things that Jerome talked about in this session, I have some things for you to do. So we have some activities or tasks that would be really helpful in thinking through some of the things that Jerome mentioned. So let's start with application number 1. So in order to find things that we're passionate about, it's important to start with big ideas. And there is a kind of activity called a heart map that will help us think through these things. So what you're going to do, the directions will remain on the screen here. I'm going to go ahead and read through those, but you are going to hit pause at the end of my instruction giving here and go ahead and apply it. So give yourself 5 to 10 minutes. If you want longer, great. Again, you hit pause and you have as much time as you want to apply these things. So a heart map, the idea is you take a big piece of paper, draw a large heart on the sheet of paper. In the center, you're going to write the most important person, place, or thing in your life. So that could be family members, friends, home, the land, the air, the water around you, those important things. And then inside the heart, you're going to write or sketch things that break your heart, that you volunteer to help with, and other topics that you're interested in researching and writing about. So you'll just fill up the entire heart. You can color code it if you want to. That's the 4th thing, is you may choose to color code the things you write or sketch. So if you want to put all the things that break your heart in red, or all the things that you volunteer to help with in purple, feel free to do so, however you want to kind of create that heart map for you. But this gives you an idea of the things you could potentially research and or write about in the future. So you're going to create the heart map now. Okay, application number 2 is generating a list of questions you might want to ask or research on one topic. So take one of those ideas from your heart map and kind of focus on those. Now you're going to find another piece of paper. Maybe it's on your smartphone, maybe it's on your laptop, whatever you want to do, but you're going to generate a list of questions. There is no number that is like ideal, but the more questions you have, then you can narrow those questions down to help you when you go to research and you ask those questions. This will also help you on the next application, which is all around conducting interviews. So generate as many questions, big questions, hows, whys, all of those open-ended questions, and take 5 to 10 minutes to do this now. All right, application number 3 is our research list. So you heard Jerome talk about the ways that he goes and researches things. He does interviews, he talks to folks, but he also goes to Google. He goes to that search engine and he uses Boolean searches to help him find the information that he is needing. So you are going to generate a list of search engines and databases that you have access to and bookmark for later use. You may not even know what I am talking about right now, and that is quite all right. because I want you to have this conversation either with your teacher that you have in the classroom, or that you can have with a friend later on. What are some of those search engines? We think of Google kind of naturally, I think, where a lot of our heads go, but there are other search engines that exist. And then there are databases, and the databases pull together, they curate all of those peer-reviewed resources or those journal articles into one place. And you can find them through Google Scholar, you can find them through your libraries. So think about what you have at your school library. If you've never been to your school library, go check it out. Or you can actually go to your public library and you have access to a lot of these databases and search engines as well. Don't forget, you can always ask a librarian for help with this. So think about what you have access to right now, even if it's just on your phone. Think about what you have access to and create a list of those search engines and databases. Okay, application number 4, preparing for an interview. You already heard Jerome talk about his process. Starts with a document, lists all the questions that he would potentially want to ask. It's what I did with him. I had all the questions that I wanted to ask, and then you go forward with your interview. So think about an interview that you might want to have with someone. You're going to write the introduction to that interview that captures your research and what you hope to accomplish with your interview. So at the beginning of my document that I just used here, I put out goals for us, for Jerome and myself, to think through what we wanted to accomplish with this conversation. We wanted you to understand his process and how he got started in this work. We wanted to learn from him and his whole process of creating these stories. So think about how you would introduce what you're doing to someone that you would interview. And then you're going to also draft 3 questions that you would want to ask in your interview. Don't worry, that would not be the ultimate number. You would want to create more than 3 questions, but start with 3 questions that you would want to ask in your interview. Take about 5 to 10 minutes to go ahead and do this. And the last thing, that's it actually, as far as the applications and the activities here. But we do want you to share this out with us. So if you have done any of these applications or these activities, take a quick photo and tweet us at the hashtag #MarchOn, share it on Facebook, share it on whatever social media platform you want to, but we would love to see some of the things that have come out of this workshop. And if you want to, make sure you tag Jerome in your tweets as well. Don't forget, there's more content and there are more things for you as a K-12 educator and teacher, or college. I should also throw that in there for our students that are joining us as well. We hope that you have enjoyed this workshop and hope that you've learned some things that you can take forward in your own activism. Thanks so much.
Well,